Hello everyone, today we talk about Europe through the eyes of the Saracens. On Schwerpunkt I made only one video on this on the Saracens proper, that is called The Saracens. I think it's the only, if you Google that, it's the only video ever created with a title like that, which naturally tells you how much this say period and topic in general is overlooked. Today we're going to talk essentially between this time between the 8th and the 10th century. Most people, I think, in popular culture like this period. If they do, which there's still very few people, only because of the Vikings, forgetting that while Northern Europe was definitely dominated by Scandinavian piracy, this south of Europe, the Mediterranean, were kind of dominated at this point. They had by the Saracens, which will have the upper hand and would maintain it in terms also of trade balance and general power, etc. For a long time, not quite as the Vikings in the north, but also in here that should be a bit of a we should compare them, maybe not today because this is not today's topic, but also in here the problem is that Europe has been much more densely populated than North Africa. So if you look at the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean, you realize that in spite of this, the perception that we have mostly in the West about this Saracens, mostly as definitely pillagers and nothing else, objectively, and would like to stress, of course, the kind of the contraction and also Saracen Piracy brought, etc. The demographical balance was still and shifted in favor of Europe at that point. So even, for instance, the ethnical impact of the Saracens was objectively low, and especially in certain areas that were mostly hit by their raids and then not properly settled, because the Saracens basically settled on as a people, demically speaking, mostly in these areas of Spain, of Sicily, but objectively didn't go much ahead elsewhere in terms of sheer demographic demographic dimension. We will see that it is important to realize what colonies were. Historically speaking, the Mediterranean saw the rise of certain civilizations that had different ways they basically managed this the settlements they created and which use they made of it along the Mediterranean shores. For instance, the Greeks made demographic colonies, usually because they literally took lots of people who were in the modern land that couldn't sustain them because of the nature of the Atlantic territory and went populating others. Other peoples, like the Phoenicians, for instance, were much more interested in really just in trade. They didn't have an enormously they didn't have a very strong demic force. They just were content of occupying these markets along the Mediterranean with certain garrisons and so on, having a very few demic impact. The Saracens were a bit like this. You can argue that the Saracen colonies, as we will see, were mostly military and trade colonies, practically, that were aimed more or less at fueling especially the slave trade in the Mediterranean, and the Europeans gladly participated to the thing. I mean, this is also another prejudice. We should look at who were the Saracens in the first place. Many people, I think, would be surprised to know, even it's a very banal thing for whoever is acquainted to the thing, that many Saracens were also Christians, and they came from areas that were actually from communities were actually European. There were many Spanish, many Italians among the Saracens, and this is Southern French and so on. So this is, and just for talking about the West, the East, that is also the Eastern Mediterranean, is also kind of overlooked because this is also how historiography works. That basically you focus only on certain, let's say, areas for which what is relevant to your specific country as kind of the precedence over the rest, but it's not really. There are other dimensions. Unfortunately, today we will not scope excessively. This was a very according to me, this is a period all to rewrite, especially when it comes to Mediterranean history, which is also objectively better documented than the Northern European one, for instance, and that instead is kind of neglected and kind of ignored, and nobody seems to be interested in this. But objectively, it was a very fascinating topic, and today we are going to essentially look at it a bit more obviously in general, because we can't do anything even in some hours if the video becomes so long, but at least looking at this kind of forgotten perspective and trying to focus a bit more on this dimension for what it was by itself. So talking about the Saracens, also in the other video we were explaining who were the Saracens. This is another matter. It's like when you say the Moors, it's a very it's a synecdoche part. It's an approximation, especially the name Saracens is this name would practically these populations of the southern shores of the Mediterranean, which were dominated by Islamic rulers, were called into the Middle Ages. And I can't find a broader, a narrower definition, because of course we mostly, when we say Saracens today, we mostly refer to those pirates, right? But even in the Crusades, powers like, Fatimid Egypt, the Ayyubids, that were, actually very solid states, even more developed in a certain measure than many Christian ones at the time, were in this sense not really pirates as we imagined them. They were called Saracens as well. But this is the point I'm making. It's like the Moors. There was never a people that was like the Moors. It doesn't make much of a sense. The name Saracens comes from Sarcenoi, which were a tribe of the Sinai Peninsula in the ancient. It's a name that stems from ancient ethnography. I know fairly nothing about the Sarcenoi. I assume there is also a very few knowledge about them, that they weren't much of an influent population in ancient history, but they were used as a sort of synecdoche to define all these peoples that now in early medieval times inhabited this southern shores of the Mediterranean, these pirates, and so on. So find Saracens, that's basically the meaning. And looking at this perspective mostly from a Western European point of view today, it's essentially the Saracen raids were being launched chiefly from Africa, but also from the coasts of Islamic Spain, over the islands and the shore, the Christian islands and shores of the Western Mediterranean. Now we will see now that this was happening pretty intensely also in the Eastern Mediterranean. We'll see how the Byzantines coped with that. There was also Byzantine piracy, which very few people actually know about, or at least they think about, because this is pretty obvious. I mean, why there couldn't be a Byzantine piracy as well? But just for saying that this thing was pretty transversal, and that also the Christians that are normally depicted as on the defensive and so on, even in the time of greater Saracen offensive indeed, were not just obviously counter-attacking and trying to repel these invasions, but also actively participating to this system for how it was being developed, because this is what we're trying to look at today. These Muslims in the Mediterranean between the 8th, the 9th and 10th century were essentially, what were they? Corsairs, pirates, or sailors / businessmen, entrepreneurs? Because this is also the point, that there was a great, against Piran's thesis that basically doesn't hold anymore, it was also a great economical potential, great economical development that the Saracens entailed. The Arab invasions in the Mediterranean didn't block at all trade. If anything, they just the Muslim power substituted into certain areas of the Mediterranean to the Christian one, essentially keeping to make trade going on. And consider that the Islamic world at this time was extended geographically at a point, and naturally there were many the trade was keeping being so international because of it. Even the contacts between areas like Spain, like Tunisia, Syria, Arabia were quite intense, and these were naturally all regions that were on the sea basically, and were connected through trade and were present along very important trade routes, as we'll see later, that connected essentially Europe with the Far East through the Muslim channel. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So, and as we were saying, this was happening also in the Eastern Mediterranean. From the 8th century, the Saracen incursions hit not only the Greek islands, but also other areas of around, basically the Saracens, the Arabs, as soon as they conquered these regions like Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, these were Egypt, these were a seat of very important shipyards and ports. So basically they seized also the shipbuilding capabilities of the Byzantines, of the communities that dwelled in these coastal centers, and immediately set up a fleet essentially to harass the Byzantine Empire against which they were with which they were at war. Also trying, in fact, to besiege Constantinople by sea, and being ultimately defeated by the Byzantine fleet, and so on. Very hit in this back in the Western Mediterranean were Sicily and Sardinia, and these raids were definitely destructive in many ways. They caused the ruin of this essentially nuclei of coastal settlements, and the fleeing of the populations in the hinterland that sometimes was definitely wilder and also difficult to reach, so that it was difficult at this time. If you look at many Mediterranean settlements, the shift of the population from the coast, where they had been used to dwell historically, to the mountains, to the hills, naturally these brought in part that gave a stimulus to Encastellation, not in the same time, in the same measure, all times. There were areas that basically saw the rise of Encastellation just after the Viking raids, chiefly because of this destructivity, if you want, because the resources now were scarce. That these raids were so dangerous. So definitely the local populations trying to seek refuge into fortified centers, but didn't have necessarily the strengths, the resources to build others. So actually in Encastellation also, and here many people say, oh well, Europe was covered in castles just because it were the Vikings, the Magyars and the Saracens hitting, right? Not really. This is not really true in the same for most of the times. Actually, Encastellation is something that was born basically within the same European society because of dynamics that are actually expressed. I try to explain quite in not maybe excessively in depth, but quite extensively. If you go in Medieval Society playlist, it's full of topics related to Encastellation. That I also saw it's a topic I seemingly am the only one to discuss on YouTube. I don't know why. Just through a simple search that you find only my results, so they're also easy to find. So it was mainly due to the strengthening of the elite's power to control the same local territories and not really to defend from. Most of the castles that were built during the second invasions were eventually abandoned. They didn't survive. So most of the castles we see today are obviously naturally from very later time, because Moat and Bailey castles were definitely not existing over time. They were mostly something we start seeing from the 12th century, something like that, were built in stone, at least the bigger ones. But let's say that the spread of Encastellation because of the second invasions has been kind of over, let's say, kind of exaggerated in some measures. I mean, there is obviously a connection, but without the say the private policy of the local lords in post-Carolingian times, basically Encastellation would have not been possible in that measure. And there are so many studies about this. One of the most important and famous is, for instance, the one of Tuber about the region around Rome that was hit hard, for instance, by Saracen raids. Saracens arrived to pillage even the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul. And that shows that basically Encastellation started only when eventually this kind of very mixed Italian coalition managed to defeat the stronghold at the mouth of the Saracen stronghold at the mouth of the Garigliano River, and it's only from that point that the Roman nobility around Rome is able to begins to build castles all around, because now the threat was over, and this great project of strategical, domination of the countryside could be carried out through the construction of castles, with a working force coming into place and so on. And this happens naturally. Just some days ago, I was talking about this in one of the comments that, one of my followers said, what about regions like Sardinia, for instance, that in the south had this kind of fertile areas, could develop to a certain point, even certain coastal centers could develop, and they didn't eventually. Well, yeah, indeed, the Saracens, as he said, did really a lot of harm, but not in fact in everywhere in the same measure as we've seen. And actually, the major coastal centers, I mean the fortified ones, that were especially in the Italian peninsula at the time, Byzantine centers, at least in theory. I mean, there was this decentralized administration from Constantinople where these cities were essentially developing on their own. Objectively, were not taken by the Saracens, first of all, but secondly, they also made in part their fortune by trading with the Saracens, in part. So actually, one of the reasons why the Saracen presence was so strong in some areas was exactly the fact it was backed by certain Christian powers, like in that case. There were certain communities, this is pure, realpolitik, and there were many strategical reasons for which even of these kind of Byzantine autonomous Byzantine city-states, some were always fighting against the Saracens. Famously, traditionally, for instance, Amalfi was like that. There were others like Gaeta instead were actually in alliance with were allied with the Saracens at some points, and so even in here, the Saracen phenomenon should be dimensioned for what it was, basically, because today I will try to show obviously how these centers had a broader connection, that these Saracens were not the stereotypical murderers and ravagers or looters. At least they weren't less than the Vikings in the essentials, but at the same time you realize that in part, and also for certain dynamics of the Islamic world, how it was, these were kind of much more they were kind of short-lived experiences overall. Aside for certain experiences, chiefly the base of Fraxinedem, for instance, the Saracens weren't eventually able to get the upper hand. Recently, I made a video about the Italian Maritime Republics, starting from the title is Italian Maritime Republics, Wealth and Power in the Mediterranean, 11th, 13th century. This is kind of the later stage of this history, for which you see that eventually these coastal cities of the Apennine Peninsula managed to basically become stronger than the Saracens, and literally, sweeping the Western Mediterranean, eliminating the Saracen presence. So the point I was making is that eventually the Saracens didn't give birth to something more consistent. The especially the history of now. It's extremely complicated because I didn't want to talk about this today. But for instance, the base of Fraxinetum, that was an enormously important center that, however, survived because of so many contingent factors, chiefly the fact that it was backed by the Caliphate of Cordoba, because without that it could have been, destroyed in a much easier way. It was an incredibly important center internationally, because basically the whole balance of Western Europe, politically speaking, was based on that. From there, the Saracens could hit into France, into Germany, into Italy. They went from there, and they existed as long as the caliphs of Spain basically backed them. But there was a problem also for the Ottonians, who, in this sense, regarded also all the various political options and preferred at a time to maintain the Saracen presence there, or at least to tolerate it in some measure, because of the relations that they were having with the Caliphate in Spain at that time. So it's very complicated. We definitely have to talk about that. And in that case, especially in southern France, Muslim presence was something that went very much on over time, and it kept, even with certain other ties. I don't know, in the 16th century, Francis I of France was still harboring the Turks into Marseille and places like this. So there were certain also political dynamics that brought to certain centers to maintain the Saracens present. And Fraxinetum is a brilliant example. But Fraxinetum, at a certain point, when the Christians decided that it had to be wiped out, because at that point was convenient for them to do so, it was wiped out. And also, as we've seen, also the Caliphate at that point didn't back the center anymore. But for saying that the other Saracen experiences in other places were relatively short-lived. We have seen how the base of the mouth of the Garigliano River, for instance, was something that could exist because of the backing of certain powers in the same Italian peninsula. Then eventually, when the broader coalition is formed, this center is wiped away. The Byzantines and even the Carolingian kingdom of Italy, that wasn't particularly bright, usually, at least it's not conceived as such in terms of military effectiveness, but they managed to wipe out the Emirates of Bari and the Emirates of Taranto, for instance. And this is what were these Emirates in the first place? There were essentially certain pirate nests, if you want. At that point, they had seized, naturally, centers like Bari and Taranto were not a few, really. But the point is also what was the political view in the Muslim world of what power should be. The Islamic world has this intrinsic contempt for earthly power. The idea is that whoever rules on earth is theoretically, someone who has in part usurped or tends to usurp, because of his sins and so on, the divine power. Whereas the Christian world is, by Judaic tradition, much more, trustful towards the constituted power, essentially. And even these Muslim centers in here represent a bit the outskirts of a world that were especially in the Mediterranean and in certain areas of the Mediterranean, wasn't so very consistently shaped and structured from a political point of view. I mean, the main centers in here were Egypt and Spain, basically, and there were these other experiments in Tunisia, for instance, but we tend to say, okay, in comparison to continental Europe, these were quite of a thing, usually, but after all, not so much. I made a video about... Now, I know I'm making it complicated, and most of what I'm saying sounds like gibberish, but I wish I had... I don't know why I digressed in this way now. But if you go into Medieval Islam playlist, for instance, there's the cultural influence of Medieval Islam, which discusses, in part, these minor centers, also in... comparing to the rest of the Islamic world and the caliphates and the various areas. If you look at these centers, kind of overlooked centers of Tunisia, of the Muslim world, that were, however, relatively important. Now, I was discussing Tunisia and Morocco chiefly, And you can understand that in spite of the importance, especially of certain cities, because the Muslim world was a world of cities indeed at this point, still the political stability was, so-so, and therefore all these experiments, like this weird and short-lived experiences, even on a place like into Italy that had, for instance, substantial strengths on its own. It was also slowly evolving, and it would all of the sudden in the 11th century getting the upper hand over let's say the Saracen Piracy, makes you understand that first of all, locally it was a great fragmentation that didn't equate necessarily to weakness proper, but mostly to it led mostly to a sort of coexistence of these powers, for which for someone was even convenient for the Saracens to stay there in part. At least in certain particular contexts, others were instead actively fighting against the Saracens, as we have seen. Even the Italic kingdom managed to seize Taranto in the south. It was also, logistically speaking, not such an easy thing, because, by the way, the kingdom was what it was. It wasn't enormously strong. They had problems also to venture into the southern areas that are very mountainous. But the idea in general is that also these Muslim powers that were created in there were something extremely temporary. They didn't have a strong root. They were mostly certain raiding bases. This is the real core of this is really the real point of the story. That there wasn't a further structured presence in there that could somehow venture beyond these coastal centers and build something consistent, because this is also the idea. It's sometimes the narrative is that like the whole southern Italy was dominated by the Saracens. No, basically the powers in the hinterland were quite autonomous. They didn't have, there was no way, in fact, for those demographic reasons that were explained before, for these northern Africans to actually build something more consistent into those areas. The only great presence in there was definitely in Sicily, and because Sicily was consistently fertile, so it basically allowed a broader power to basically develop, and secondly, because it was close to Tunisia, that was, as we've seen, one of the poles now of Muslim power. It was the Aghlabids that conquered Sicily and created an emirate in there. But when this the Saracen presence had to go north of southern Italy, for instance, at that point it became kind of a problem. And if you see that, it's not that the Saracens were much interested either much into those lands, and they probably couldn't occupy them. It was not convenient. But even their trade stopped there. I mean, even by reflection, let's say, the Muslim geographical knowledge kind of stopped at a point to southern Italy, and this is pretty strange, because objectively the Muslims were quite acute geographers at that point, that they expanded far beyond the Dar al-Islam, even in places like Africa or Southeast Asia. But when it came to Europe, to continental Europe, they basically weren't much of a, there isn't much of an interest. This is naturally explained partly because their trade stopped there, but that's actually the point. Where did the trade stop there? Because there were other communities now there that were essentially conflictual towards them, and they didn't let them pass in part. So, but the idea that I would like to stress today is how coexistential sometimes the Saracen presence was with Christian powers, and how these Christian powers in part also benefited from the trade with the Saracens, because they were in this way inserted into a circuit that was much larger than what was happening in Europe. It's not surprised that powers eventually, like the Maritime republics, eventually rose in such a consistent way, apparently out of the blue, but really having in reality highly benefited in the previous times from this kind of trade, in spite of all the overall instability that existed. But this is the point, that instability produces also the flourishing of certain smaller centers that are able to carve their own power into a system that it offers this kind of series of constant opportunities to aggrandize its own power. Excuse me, I drink a little bit once again. So what was the objective of the Saracen piracy? Well, the Saracens also in here, from a strategical point of view, you can understand what really their mindset was, and how let's say pragmatic they were, and what also their actual capability of penetration to those lands was relatively low. Because the main modus operandi, let's say, was the quick raid. So essentially the kidnapping of people, because this was the point, chiefly usually young people, that could fuel, in this sense, the flourishing slave trade that existed in the Mediterranean. And in part, there was also, from a more of a diplomatical point of view, the imposition of certain tributes and ransoms also for those prisoners that were, let's say, also pretty much remunerative. And the same creation of these corsair nests, the creation of a corsair nest was something relatively rarer. Also in here, the objective of seizing practically certain coastal centers was usually something seldom, because evidently the Saracens didn't see this as a very convenient thing to do, because a base, a stronghold, naturally has to be maintained, has to be defended, and most of these pirates didn't have objectively the interest to build something stronger in there, because they evidently understood that there were other powers that could have threatened them, and unless it wasn't an extremely convenient and remunerative kind of productive, profitable, lucrative, fruitful enterprise, they quite didn't they didn't care after all. So these nests that were created, I mean the few nests were created, have to be considered of essentially nothing more than a small trade/military colony. But in rarer occasions, like especially Fraxinatum, but we can make also other centers, there were longer settlements, there were more stable settlements that in fact were created in areas where the local political power was on average weaker. In the case of Fraxinatum, for instance, and that was more than a small colony, exactly because we were telling you before that the southern France was very fragmented, politically speaking. They didn't like much of the Carolingian presence, for instance, originally speaking. They were always kind of trying to be autonomous in many ways, and this is a constant up to the point, basically the French crown in the 13th century didn't basically seize, appropriate itself of those lands. So surprisingly enough, all these cities of southern France were happier of the Saracen presence in there than someone else, because the Saracen presence brought to this other element was an allergen element that wasn't irreconcilable essentially with the with imperial and Christian rule in there. These small cities were, not really small cities, but these cities were interested mostly in trade. So even if these Saracens were sometimes, say, unruly, they had obviously a quite unstable power on their own. Well, that was fantastic, because after all, they weren't such a imposing presence, and their and the same presence there was tied basically to the trade with these other local communities. Just imagine them having, all jointly opposed the Saracens' presence in there. Someone would have maybe they would have not been able to seize, especially Fraxinetum was very difficult to take. Eventually, it took the some effort to storm it, but generally speaking, such bases were not were not functional as long as you didn't find someone you could trade with locally, and that could absorb your could essentially benefit from also your trade exchange, and that could make the same base secure, because this also was a problem. Who could go there if the situation was too complicated? It's true that all these prisoners that were taken from the Rhine Valley, from Piedmont, from other areas of France, for instance, were to be exported into a much wider, at a wide range, basically. So not just with the local communities. But if it hadn't been for these, the Saracens' presence would have not continued for centuries in there. And this is pretty from any kind of perspective you want to see this locally. In spite of the war, that definitely also existed in part, but it was mainly the greater powers in Europe that at this point were against that presence. And also in here, it's difficult to look at it, because also different regions had kind of different interests. For instance, well, okay, maybe this is not really important, but let's say that there were other permanent settlements in areas that were by themselves more isolated, and in this sense also more easily controllable and very well placed strategically into the Mediterranean. For instance, this is the case of the Mediterranean islands of Crete, Malta, Sicily, and the Balearic archipelagos that were all conquered by the Saracens during the 9th, 10th century, and were eventually to be maintained for more or less longer time. So when it gets to describing the Saracens, it's usually Western historiography stresses them as corsairs, were not even pirates. Naturally, as I personally have a much there is sometimes that I usually like to tell history in a fashion that is radically different from what others say. But usually I concentrate on on going against stereotypes and prejudices and so on. But when it comes to the Saracens, I try to remain always more objective even than others, and yet I can't help but to think that in part these were just pirates in many ways. I mean, there is no much of a different way you can see them. Considering them corsairs probably could be more correct, and there is no this is also probably one of the elements that has not been much taken into consideration. That is the point I was making before relatively to Islamic political theory and practice in those times, for which essentially these major centers of the Muslim world, also in the Mediterranean, like Spain, Tunisia, etc., were essentially using Saracen piracy to essentially as an economic, as a spin-off, economically speaking, for trade. Part why was done and how. So they were these pirates were kind of acting on behalf of these powers in some ways. And even when you find these titles of Emirate of Taranto, for instance. So what do you think that? Why were these will call Emirates? Well, because the idea is that these pirates tried in some measure to see their power recognized by these other political entities of the larger political entities of the Muslim world that were created, of course, in their view through divine will, and getting a sanction of their power from these entities equated to getting a greater prestige in some way. So it was normal that even some relatively small entities would call themselves emirates, because it kind of gave them a greater legitimacy in the eyes of many at that point. But at the same point, these were, as we've seen, quite short-lived experiences, and the greater dominions were basically maintained through a more direct control from the major Muslim powers, such as like in the case of Cordoba and of Sicily, evidently. But also in here, these powers were quite fragmented in many ways. The case of Sicily is kind of evident. Like the major center was Palermo at the time, and that's where theoretically the emirate ruled from, at least in the island, because the main center was still Tunisia. But if you look at the around the city, especially in the east of the island, you realize that the effective control, the effective rule of the Sicilian emirs was very low. This happened because usually it was a matter of land distribution. I mean, those were areas that had not met a quite solid administration before. I mean, the Byzantines, there is the idea that wherever the Byzantines were, there was such a functional government, everything was structured and so on. But this is not really true, especially in the case of Italy. It was pretty much decentralized. There were surely certain forms of administration and local management that definitely stemmed from that Roman bureaucratic tradition and so on. But hey, we're talking about the 8th, the 9th century. We don't have to think of anything highly sophisticated and state-like, as it's often said. So when the one thing was in part I'm trying to make a parallelism with Spain, because Spain in that case was essentially a strong state, but also for that in that case I don't know how really that owed to the pre-existing Roman administration, and that partly had survived also under the Visigoths or not, because objectively at that point, in my opinion, is the Caliphate of Cordoba was powerful enough, mostly even before the fragmentation with the Taifas. Just it happened much later, because the Arabs at that point controlled this extremely fertile land of Andalusia, and that's essentially it. I mean, that was objectively one of the wealthiest areas of the Mediterranean. And with Sicily, and so they, in that case, in Spain, they seized, the conquest of Spain was quite rapid, so they also gave it probably a more orderly asset, in the sense that they basically seized everything that already existed there and tried to give it an orderly fashion. The conquest of Sicily was much more complicated. First of all, Tunisia was relatively, the Aghlabite power was relatively weak, and if you see how, relatively weak compared to Cordoba, for instance. But and therefore, even if you look at the conquest of Sicily, it was something very, first of all, it's very foggy because the sources are what they are. but secondly, it seemingly started in part through this kind of hybrid in character of both, the kind of Tunisian state, if we want to call it like this, but it's a big word at that point, and the Piracy. And plus, the Sicilian resistance was extremely harsh. I mean, the Arabs took really a freaking lot of time before conquering Taormina from the other side. And there were still Byzantine garrisons, but it seems also the local population was extremely hostile. So the way it happened, basically, Sicily was enormously fertile, but nevertheless, the process through which it was conquered brought it to be to the essentially the failure of the creation of a more centralized government, and Muslim Sicily was essentially a cluster of countless smaller country lordships, Muslim lordships that had no cohesion. That's why also the Normans eventually had such an easy time at seizing Sicily. It took quite a time because now all these lordships had kind of a castle on their own in there, but they had no cohesion. So it just was a very slow, methodic campaign that took decades for seizing every single Sicilian Muslim stronghold in Sicily, and eventually to reorganize in a more centralized fashion. At that point, you have to give credit to the Normans for having been able eventually to centralize in a consistent fashion more than what existed before. That is, and this is the point, and that I have discussed in the few videos I made on Norman Sicily, is that I never bought, historiographically speaking, the idea that the pre-existent, the influx of the Byzantine and Saracen, and Emiral organization kind of administration and bureaucracy gave a solidity to the Norman state. I personally don't believe it. I think the history went the other in a very different fashion, and it's much more complicated. Feudalism also in Norman Sicily was very, very strong, and it was counterbalanced with other communities that, in the sense, Normans mostly integrated into their institutional system, or at least as active parts of their political management of the kingdom. And when we look at the centralized power, we're mostly looking at the reshaping of certain forms that probably existed before, especially in emiral times, but that were consistently and robustly reinforced with now a greater power that was the one the Normans had for having seized essentially these very florid areas of southern Italy, southern peninsular Italy and Sicily as a whole, in a relatively few time, and having managed to condensate those resources into the construction of a kingdom with a capital, with a bureaucracy, with an administration, but not necessarily drawing from such a highly sophisticated. In fact, this is the general picture that I have of the Saracens, that their fortune in terms of trade and so on really stemmed much from the fact that they had a relatively low political cohesion. There was a lot of dynamism in there that favored also trade with the other centers, and was looking, all this fragmentation was essentially pushing for competition. But at the same time, there was no way to build something more consistent. And that's it. In fact, in the area, there was no major in the central Mediterranean, there was no central power, no central pole of power at that point. Tunisia was partially the biggest thing that existed at that point. It was fairly powerful, but it didn't have the resources to extend its power once again on Sicily, for instance, while it was reconquered by the Normans, if not trying maybe, but much later times, was the the reconstruction of certain power, but it was never such a enormous thing. So even the Saracens' presence has to be understood mostly from a trade point of view, from a commercial point of view. This is really what made, for instance, Palermo such a huge city, because it was a big trade center. But it was a big trade center also because there was a relatively weak political authority that could not impose itself in a solidly strong style of fashion like it was happening, I don't know, in Spain, in Egypt, or in Iraq. This is the picture, at least I've brought, and I think that especially the Arab Sicily is being too magnified as a pole of civilization. It was surely very advanced in many ways. We have lost also most of what existed in there. Also, the Norman conquest was quite dramatic from the Muslim side. I mean, many Muslims basically fled back to Tunisia when the Normans were conquering the island. So there were many upheavals that naturally wiped out but if you look at Sicily objectively, aside from very few, extremely few buildings, but they're also relatively small, there is no thing like an archaeological presence of the Arabs. I mean, most of what we call of Arab of Arab Sicily actually is from Norman times, because there were still Arabs, or better Arabicide craftsmen that actually were practically Sicilian, that worked for the Normans and preserving that kind of Eastern influenced art and so on, but not really. There is no other strong presence of a solid infrastructural presence of the Arabs. There's no evidence for a solid infrastructural presence of the Arabs in there. It is also important because most of what we get from big empires as an evidence of their solidity and structure and so on is these great infrastructures. I mean, if you take Muslim Spain, well, that has left a freaking lot of things in terms of building infrastructures. Think about all the mosques eventually transformed into churches and so on. If you go to Sicily, and I think also to Tunisia, you don't find much of that. You don't find much of that objectively. So also the broader picture is should be it's a part of history, in my opinion, should be looked at into greater detail and greater depth. Naturally, a great problem with this is that there is a relatively few Western scholars that are interested into this, that can read the Arab texts of the time, that get interested into this particular area of Sicily, and Tunisia, that are relatively less documented. But that's, according to me, an area, a field, a subject that should be profitably reconsidered, and probably there is someone who is studying these things, but this is at least my personal idea. So what I was saying before is that Western historiography liked to describe the Saracens mostly in their marauding side. You know, the idea that there were certain corsairs or pirates, let's say. But there was a certain control that the Saracens from this coastal nuclei could often manage to control to the territorial areas with the together with the relative part of sea, let's say, surrounding. So the concept of the Saracens as marauders essentially is so just kind of this destructive force is definitely reductive, as we've seen, and as we were saying before, the great activity of the Italic marinary cities just a few decades later, this phase really tells us that there had been lots of activities that had been favored locally also by this Saracen presence. So the the narrative that at a certain point the Christians got the upper hand because they've been so pressed by the Saracens that they had to break and eventually to defeat them is reductive in the sense that probably the horizons of these cities had been already enlarged by the same Saracen presence, and that this expansion had been harbored also within the relations with the Saracens. In fact, the analogies between these Italic cities and the Saracen coastal centers are remarkably strong. Obviously, there was a substantial difference that you can stress conceptually, considering these were cities proper. Paradoxically, this, especially the first Italian maritime republics were chiefly in the south, and these were kind of strongly urbanized areas, and in fact they were not seized by the Saracens because there was not even mean at the time to conquer such well fortified communities that as we've seen, the Saracens preferred the hit and run strategy along the coasts, just to pillage and so on, not etc. to really seize big cities unless there wasn't a very weak political cohesion locally. I mean, the case of Taranto and Bari, for instance, stemmed chiefly, I think, from partly the crisis that existed into those specific centers between and the wars that had occurred between the Byzantines, the Longobards, the Carolingians, and so on. So those were not to expand as maritime city centers, but these other, especially these Tyrrhenian cities in south of Italy, were kind of strong on their own, and there was not much the Saracens could practically do, if not trying to kind of engage them partly into this trade and becoming partners in certain activities. Whereas the southern shores of the Mediterranean were definitely less urbanized and didn't see the rise of certain specific coastal centers as much as it was happening into the Italian peninsula indeed. And this is kind of interesting as well. It would be interesting to observe from an archaeological point of view also. Naturally, there were certain centers. Carthage, for instance, was still a thing there, but eventually, even if you take Carouan, that was mostly that was a terrestrial, that was not a coastal city, for instance. So you realize that also in here there were differences, but in the places of origin, but there was a common interest in trade in those activities, and the fact that eventually the Italic cities got the upper hand is due probably to this pre-existent infrastructural base that the North Africa didn't quite have in the same measure, and also certain other evident reasons. I mean, naturally, Italy as a whole was more fertile. It was also more populated, as we've seen. It was more connected also to other markets. It was framed, in spite of all the political fragmentation, into a kind of a broader system that, especially in southern Italy, it was not really. I'm talking about the Holy Roman Empire that didn't encompass quite southern Italy, but still, those Christian cities were living into the orbit of that world, so that they were starting to be connected also to the continental traffics and so on. What is fascinating about this is, as we were saying before, that as far as we know, Muslim trade with these centers stopped roughly to southern Italy. So we don't have much of an evidence of what was happening, I don't know, in central or northern Italy, into which, by the way, certain other maritime republics, especially Pisa and Genoa, were the most ferocious. Eventually, in the fight with the Saracens, managed basically to to conquer the Western Mediterranean from them, were developing. But even the southern Italian cities were, however, framed into a trade that, while a trade system that, while mostly concentrated and orientated towards the Mediterranean, and chiefly the Eastern Mediterranean, well, not so much, let's say both Western and Eastern Mediterranean at that point, were still in contact with continental Europe, in part, or at least they interacted with markets that were connected to that one. And that's why, in part, they were also making a fortune because of this, because as we will see later, the Europeans at this point were already exporting consistent amounts of things like iron, timber, slaves, and so on. So this would start happening. For instance, Venice would make a freaking fortune because of that. And Venice was traditionally mostly a Byzantine center as well, and was forbidden even to trade with the Muslims because of this reason. And there was a kind of even internal evolution in how the Venetian Republic shaped itself identitarily and institutionally because of what was happening in the Mediterranean. But we will arrive to that. The point I wanted to make is that there were many similarities essentially in the activities. This is probably better, of the Italic centers and the Saracens, because this idea of sudden attacks, blitz by sea, and so on were now pretty transversal. The naval clashes at this point were also that were alternated with a good trade partnership, were essentially there. That there were these activities were characterizing the whole Mediterranean from both the sides of it, and it's eventually in the 11th century that the Christians get the upper hand, as we've seen, and from then on, the Saracen settlements had been either to the Saracen settlements had been more constantly active and dynamical, whereas afterwards it's the Saracens actually that pass on the defensive, while the Christians were registering an ever greater growth and power. And anyway, one of the principal factors of the development of these small republics of say sailors / corsairs / merchants was revolving around slavery, practically in from the Muslim side, especially small Muslim centers were called Bayriyun, and they were flourishing around the Mediterranean through the capture and the trade of slaves. This is the typical case, for instance, of a city like Almeria in Andalusia in the southeast roughly of Spain during the 10th century, that developed, in fact, principally to this flourishing activity. The white slaves were called the Sakaliba, and they were particularly prized say trade good, even if it's said to kind of call people like that, but this is what slavery was in practice. And there was also another typical activity that was castration, actually, that was carried out actually by the Jews of the close Pequina or Pechina, I don't know, it's said in Spanish, that was close to Almeria, and that basically lived in part as a secondary activity for around this next to this Muslim trade, for instance. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, things were instead quite different in many ways because of the presence of the Byzantine Empire. That naturally was something extremely different from what existed into the West. At this point, the West was extremely fragmented. The Byzantine Empire, in spite of all the contraction, the crisis, had remained a state, had remained a centralized entity with a fleet, importantly enough. That is something that was still functioning in there. And in here, basically, the Basileis carried out a counteroffensive, especially under the Macedonian dynasty, for which the islands of Cyprus and of Crete were reincorporated in the second half of the 10th century under Byzantine control. And even the trades, after the most critical phase of Muslim expansion on the seas between the second half of the 7th and the first 8th century, were slowly recovering. Even if the Western Europeans were not essentially the major protagonists, nor the kind of the best clients, let's say, in many ways. For instance, in around 846, Ibn Khurdad Bach, in his book of the Routes and of the Kingdoms, was talking about the merchants coming from Europe, from Western Europe, and that were surely living in there, but these were not really, the typical Western Europeans, because these were Jews actually, and this is very important. It's a very overlooked topic, that even before Italian seamanship in medieval times into Mediterranean, it actually was the Jews that from the West were actually very active in a trade with the East. In this book, the Jews are called Radanites, and we don't know what it really means. It might be that it was meaning that these were the Jews coming from the Rhone Valley, and that is an etymological hypothesis that has been made. And objectively, as we have seen before, the cities of the Rhone Valley were pretty much involved in trade with the Saracens, and this would explain much, because that was a kind of flourishing basin and quite a wealthy place. And the Jews at this point were basically bringing to the east, the Jewish merchants bringing to the east the certain Western products, such as slaves, weapons, and furs, which were unloaded in the ports of the Nile Delta, for instance, and that were even brought by the same merchants, Jewish merchants, by land, on camelback, let's say, through up to the Red Sea. And here these goods were embarked, and for the Arab ports of, for instance, Al-Jar and Jeddah, and from there to India and China. So you understand here that the long range of the range of this trade that was definitely very long and intercontinental, and that proves the existence at all these times of an international trade that the Saracens had not stopped, that Saracen Piracy had not stopped, but on the contrary had probably in part also enhanced and fueled. So and this went also the other way around, because from these Far East there were other products that instead were imported by the Jewish merchants into Europe, such as musk, for instance, alloy wood, camphor, cardamom, that were brought back and sold not only to Egypt, but also at Constantinople and even in the, let's say, rougher courts of Western Europe. So interestingly enough, this is what we were saying before, there were Christian communities at this point that were wealthy. And this is very important in trade balance, because what you realize in here is that this trade was not monopolized by the Saracens. I mean, the Saracens would have had such an oppressive, monopolistic power if they had physically controlled and maintained these areas of southern Europe, like southern France and southern Italy, but they didn't, because the fortune they were making at that point was by trading with, I mean, they obviously didn't have, obviously it would have been more convenient for them to have invaded these places, but they weren't weak enough. They hadn't the political and military consistency to occupy those lands. They could, however, trade with these merchants, like in southern France with the Jews, or also in Italy in part, because Jewish communities were present also in those centers of southern Italy. There was a very thriving community in Naples, for instance, and eventually with the Italian maritime republics that at this point weren't just, passively on saying now the Mediterranean is ruled by the Saracens. It's not really like that. These were trading with them, and they were the mean that could bring basically these goods also from continental Europe into the Saracen markets. So what you see is that the Saracen horizons, the Muslims' horizons, stopped, and we'll see it now, to southern Italy. And those who actually made the work going on, the trade going on, were these communities were in there. So this all together, naturally with war, with raids, with something like that, but that at the same time fueled trade. And this was normal. This was happening also elsewhere. Now we're talking mostly about the Saracens stereotypically in the Mediterranean, but this is something that was happening, for instance, with the also with the Varangians in Russia. There was a very intense trade between countries like Sweden, like Scandinavia, and the Muslim world, and this where you find certain Buddha statues in Sweden from that time, for as far as I can remember. Other artifacts from a closer place, and I remember, were into Iceland, because that was another major trade channel, so that the Vikings and the Saracens interacted intensely and trading and making a freaking fortune out of that. So it's very meaningful that the geographical knowledge and the Muslim trade and geographical knowledge were not essentially interested between the 9th and the 10th century almost at all. For instance, just in the northern Tyrrhenian Sea, northern Amalfi or Gaeta, for instance, and the Western European world in general. And there are people who say, well, this is due also to the fact that the traditional Muslim culture of the time was basically kind of, willingly ignoring other countries that this culture didn't deem as at its own level. I have doubts on this interpretation, because objectively the Muslims at the time were extremely curious about the rest of the world. There was a great interest also towards the Vikings at that point. We know that Muslim explorers, etc., went very far. They reached the Arctic Pole, for instance. They went into Black Africa. They reached as far as Indonesia and so on. So this is probably reductive, but nevertheless, it's extremely meaningful that objectively the Muslim world, as far from as we can see, was not particularly interested in continental Europe at the time. This can be interpreted in the sense also through the more solid fabric of Western society at this point was maybe passive at a epiphenomenal level, you know, given these Saracen raids that hit and so on, and the difficulties of Latin Germanic Europe in the gestation of a institutional entity that could, you know, cope with, you know, and provide a consistent control. I don't know how I was going with this phrase, but it's as if, you know, there was an obstacle for which the Muslims could not go far without at least, you know, depending on these other mediums of trade chiefly. And as we've said now, also that's the general political situation in the Western Mediterranean, for which objectively was no major Muslim power that was attempting to expand into continental Europe. I mean, the Caliphate of Cordoba at this point was very powerful, but even if you look at it, it had huge difficulties even at expanding northern, you know, to northern Spain, or to this area that was dominated by the Carolingian and post-Carolingian powers. It definitely had a huge power, huge influence, but at the same time, the capacity of controlling or expanding was relatively limited also in there. The same Iberian Peninsula has these evident geographical borders for which, at that point, it was, you know, for the Caliphate was essentially more convenient just to consolidate its own power in the peninsula and then thinking of expanding elsewhere, because simply there weren't resources. So even the need of knowing what was beyond was relative, mostly had to do with trade. And if it and therefore the Saracens were a bit the vanguards as corsairs of this that could kind of test how far Muslim trade could penetrate basically in this area, and that was it. And that's why also the Caliphate of Cordoba patronized certain centers like the Saracen base of Fraxinedum, because that was the only kind of, it was like a proxy state basically, a buffer state that they could control in there without getting directly involved, because they knew that in this politically fragmented Mediterranean it was full of Muslim pirates that could work like that and create and partially extend, in fact, the trade of let's say the commercial horizons of these major centers like the Caliphate up to there, but they couldn't bring it on. They couldn't bring it far. I mean, also the idea that, I don't know, the Muslims having conquered Spain could swarm into Gaul and conquer everything. It's kind of fantasy, historically speaking. There was no base to do that, and even these same powers that we've seen were not strictly Muslim. I mean, these were still kind of a European power in practice. Also, the Aghlabite power across Tunisia and Sicily was not this big thing. It's not that they aimed at ever reaching elsewhere. The resources were limited. We're talking about the early Middle Ages. It was already a big thing to have realized this, and there were not bases to bring this further in many ways. So this is at least my opinion of the wall. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. Although this perspective can be a bit reversed if you consider that, aside from trade, that you know, at least made ideas, knowledge flowing in some ways, there was also a consistent political and military interaction sometimes. So I'm not saying that this, you know, trade is, I mean, war, more than anything else, probably is one of the greatest hybridizers of civilizations in many ways. And this strict differentiation between, in fact, the Mediterranean areas and also Europe, between the Christian and Muslim world, actually at the time was much more blurred than what we usually think. there was also still full of Christians into the Muslim lands, in part. And vice versa, by the way, especially in Spain, you see that that was a world that basically was created also when even in there the Christians got the upper hand, with the integration of these Muslim communities, because there were simply people who paid taxes to them, who were already into trade, into crafts and so on. So why? And this was a moment of also great contact between Western and Eastern culture. I recently discussed about Gerbert d'Aurillac, for instance, and how his education in Spain, in Saragossa, at the borders essentially with the Muslim Caliphate, was extremely important for defining the cultural development of what would have been Pope Sylvester II, and also in the strengthening and the shaping of the intellectual awareness of the Roman Church at one point. So this was a time of certain interactions that we have reduced to war, to the Saracens that arrived from the sea just raping and pillaging and so on. And then instead was which happened at all times in history, even before and even afterwards in all the context, and that instead hit a much greater net of relations that contributed to shape definitely the world of the time in the following centuries. There are certain anecdotes that we can't, even the same prisoning and slavery at the same time could be a vehicle of this awareness. Many people say, oh well, you're pushing this for... No, because actually there is a story that's quite interesting. The story of Harun ibn Yahya, that actually we don't know whether he was Christian or Muslim from the name, because this is actually a story that is narrated by another. We don't have the direct source from him. It's a story written by Ibn Rusta in the 10th century. Was a geographer, by the way. But this was evidently coming from another literary tradition that was talking about this guy, that in spite of everything, all the shitty things that happened to him, he still did a hell of a journey at the time, because he arrived to visit actually the two Romes, both the new and the old one. And who was he? We don't really know. This is interesting, because all we know from the story is that he was captured on the Palestinian shores, perhaps during a corsair expedition. And what we don't know, and this is also interesting, it's not clear whether if he was captured by certain pirates or certain corsairs, there could be not just Arabs, there could be Byzantines as well, or whether he belonged to a Arab corsair crew himself. And we've seen that in Arab corsair crews there could be Christians as well. So try to imagine, because this is really the point, because how you can't objectively divide the things in two. Either the Christians from one side, the Muslims from the other. It wasn't like that. We know by fact, by sources, that it wasn't like that. So this capture happened at a certain time while he was assaulting a Greek ship. And basically this thing the assault failed, and the guy got captured. So at this point, Harun was brought as a slave to Constantinople. So from there, and we don't know why, maybe I don't know, because of a Byzantine embassy, it might have been, but he went through up the Balkanic Peninsula. He reached basically northeastern Italy, and he went into eventually to Rome. And as we were saying before, Harun didn't leave anything written because his hard knocks were and experiences have been handed down to us through the history of the geographer Ibn Rusta in the 10th century. And the traveler, however, as we've seen, he visited the Venetian area, the country of the Longobards, so as it was called, the Italic kingdom at that point, even if the Longobards didn't rule in it anymore, but that was how they felt them to be. He basically was in Pavia as well, that was the capital both of the Longobard and the Carolingian kingdom of Italy, and reaching through the French way, pilgrims, he reached Rome. And we don't really know what he saw in there, because Ibn Rusta wrote essentially to certain legendary topoi that were similar to the one of the later Mirabilia. So essentially he was writing through certain literary models that really at this point weren't quite objective. I mean, we don't know much about this tradition now, this story, and at the time writers followed these canons without really caring much about the context, because maybe they didn't know them, or maybe they cared obviously about the context, but in this kind of a topic way, in many ways. And the Mirabilia, or better, the Mirabilia came later, but there was this kind of tradition of the marvels of the world that were already pretty much alive to the Byzantine culture, and that had been already handed over to the Islamic one at this point. So he, in the story, he talks about kind of relatively strange things, such as, for instance, the bronze embankments of the Tiber river, or the pretty marvelous and prodigious bird automaton that was at the top of a column in front of St. Peter, and the infinite riches and the numerous population of Rome that, instead for what we know, during the 9th and 10th century was not very populated, definitely was relatively depressed. So naturally, there are, this is not very realistic, and more meaningful information instead comes, more reliable information comes from from Ibn al-Khal, who was from Iraq, and in that around the mid of the 10th century carried out a long travel from Persia to Spain, describing many different centers of the Christian of the Western world. For instance, he traveled into Sicily. He described Muslim Palermo, for instance, but he also went into the Christian world, into the southern Italic world that was split at the time between the Longobards and the Byzantines. He visited the cities of Salerno, Melfi, and the same Naples, where he states to have personally appreciated the quality of the of certain clothes, chiefly the linens, basically, and other goods that were particularly praised, and that were traded into the city, or could be found in there. There was a particular taste at this point also in the Muslim world for certain Western products, and probably the most important one was iron. The so-called Frankish world could offer this kind of goods, among which iron and weapons and so on were particularly praised. In fact, one of the most praised iron products was the Frankish swords, that at the time were very much appreciated for solidity and beauty in the Muslim world, and that were in fact compared to the Gawhar, that was the Yemenite white steel, that was considered as beautiful, like a precious cloth in there. So another very important good that could come from the land of the Franks, or from the Byzantine world, or through the Russian rivers and the Black Sea into the Dar al-Islam, was timber. This was not surprising indeed, because the Muslim world was traditionally not extremely wealthy in this resource, was not rich in timber, and there is actually a letter, I think, from 813, into which Pope Leo III informed Charlemagne that certain Saracen ambassadors had preferred to make a journey to Sicily on Venetian ships, because it says in Latin "in navigis benedicorum," so in the ships of the Venetians, and then their own, because this is very important into the Mediterranean. So with all this naval activity, the problem was to find wood and to find timber. That in the Islamic world was rather scarce, and therefore the Maghrebine navies, let's say, had to take this into account. But this message also already shows the appearance of the Italian ships into the equation, in the Venetians that were venturing into the Muslim countries. This is very important because similarly to the Byzantine Empire, the Venetians had created at the time had established certain laws according to which they were forbidden to trade with, for instance, with Alexandria and with Egypt, because this had been conquered by the Muslims. So the Byzantines, by traditions, had imposed to these communities to say, okay, you don't have to trade with any land that is occupied by the so-called nefandissima gens Saracenorum, like it was said in Latin at least, which means the dreadful Saracen people, essentially. And there is an episode that is very kind of mythical in nature in many ways, that would basically have happened, I think, roughly into the mid-9th century. It is essentially the recovery of St. Mark's Evangelist relics from Alexandria by certain Venetian merchants, and that is really important because it's just a legend, that St. Mark is the patron of Venice, and this story, naturally, imagine, even when we were talking about before this stories about the Saracens traveling, just imagine what 9th century sources can can be like. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read them or so on, but obviously still very, aside from the scanty quantity of this scanty character of this material, but also the content is kind of sometimes and difficult to interpret. So this idea that the Venetians kind of took away this in a the relics of San Mark, they subtracted them from the Saracens in a kind of a raid or something like that, actually seems to be just a nobilization of an action that might have happened actually through trade with the Muslims, and not just because they went there and they stole it with force, and so making this deed of the Christians that recovered the thing. And in fact, the same Venetian government in part was enforcing this idea that no trade had to be carried out with the Muslims. But in 960 there was again this this measure was this prohibition was reiterated, because evidently this was kept go on, and especially it was stated not to trade slaves and not to transport foreign passengers on the ships that were coming to Venice. And in another document that is dated to 971, there was the admission that it was admitted that the Venetians were used to bring timber, metal, and weapons to sell in the markets of Alexandria, Egypt. So it's something would change with the election of the Doge Peter II or Sale that ruled from 991 to 1008, because this kind of changed the economical and commercial horizons of the Venetians for a while, because basically the Doge conquered Istria and Dalmatia. So this redefined in a greater measure the intensity and convenience in the commercial relations, both with Constantinople and the Fatimid Caliphate of Al Cairo at the same time. The relation with Constantinople is reaffirmed by the Chrysobulla, so the Golden Bull. This document was solemnly sealed with the with this golden seal, in fact, in 992. We know, I said very few about the agreements with Egypt that, however, were to continue actually between Venice and this Muslim power for a very long time, because Venice basically had as a best trade partner and the Egyptian power for a long time. This is evident for many reasons. Naturally, the relations could be even strained at a point, because the Venetians, by the way, were extremely rapacious in many ways, so also the local authorities were kind of cautious, but at the same time the Venetian presence basically ensured these powers this access now on the European markets that at this point, as we were saying before, were accelerating practice, and especially in the exports and so on. And Egypt was a consistent power, so as we have seen, they needed timber and weapons, so they were slaves, so these were all goods that were very useful also for a florid aggressive power. And just thinking this, the Venetians were quite dual, because they were keeping to trade with Egypt even when there were the Crusades, and so when Egypt were fighting with the Crusader states, and that's why also, for instance, Venice was quite worried of this, and it was fundamentally enemy with Venice, with Pisa and Genoa, that were instead to more against the Saracens and allied with the Crusaders at that point. And the deep friendship that existed between Venice and Egypt remained basically firm, even through the crisis of the Crusades and also the collapse of the Fatimid Caliphate during the 12th century, and the also coup d'état of the Mamluks in the 13th. So they kept trading with there. And interestingly enough, these lands were also pretty they were importing grain. Egypt traditionally had been, and it kept exporting grain in part, but sometimes they even imported the Sicilian grain or other stuff, because now Europe was expanding at a level that they even were now in trade balance were unfavored also in cereal exports. That is extraordinary. So another problem that we have historically is that between the 9th and the 10th century, our availability of written sources about trade between the Muslim and the Frankish world is pretty low. In fact, there is a very important archive in Geniza at Al Cairo in Egypt that. However, it's not truly enough, or at least I don't think that certain studies are very developed at the point. But another great help has come from archaeology, because there is a remarkable quantity of finds that show from underwater research, let's say. So subaqua research or digging, I don't know how to say that actually prove the presence of a not indifferent circulation of goods between the 9th and the 10th century, especially also in the northern Tyrrhenian Sea. So even that oblivion that we can find in the Arab sources in this last time towards those areas actually is not related probably to the absence of trade in there, but mostly through a kind of political forgetfulness about those areas, because they couldn't basically penetrate them in other ways. And most of these finds show naval relics, as you can imagine, which contained ceramic material. And we don't really understand much. Also, in here there is a huge debate in the academy, because we don't have the exact quantities. We don't know how this finds are. Also, especially subaqua archaeological inquiries naturally very costly, so we start finding these things, but we don't quite understand yet, at least, and probably never will fully, but how intense such trade practically was. But nevertheless, it's very important that such finds are there, and that we can observe them, analyze them, and confrontate them with historiographical sources. Another very important fundamental evidence of the now acknowledged importance of Arab trade into the Mediterranean is the spread of Muslim coins that were quite soon basically being used in parallel, and also substituting certain areas the hegemony of the Byzantine denarius, the famous Perperus or Byzantus. So the so obviously the Byzantine coins didn't disappear, even, but let's say the in certain areas, especially the Western Mediterranean, the Arab coins were hegemonic as a currency system, and in fact the Arabs had substantially imitated the same Byzantine coinage. The Arab dinar would be basically similar to the Byzantine denarius in itself. We have quite of an evidence, especially from the Arab Sicilian coins. It weighed 4.25 grams of gold. Even though the most widespread was the fourth of dinar, the so-called rubai, that was rapidly spreading the centuries between the 9th and 10th century, not only in Sicily but also in southern peninsular Italy, where it took the name of tari, which means fresh. Therefore, a coin that was freshly minted in practice. So that this stated, the novelty in part, but also probably the fact that new mints were being created and stuff like that. And this tari would basically remain traditional into these southern Italian areas, into very relatively, for several centuries. And the silver coins were instead mostly represented by the dirham. That is another name that derived from the Greek, essentially from the drachma, even though it wasn't translated directly to Arab, but it was mediated by Persian and then passing to Arab. There was 2.9 grams of silver, and there was also the small karuba of 2 decigrams. So the tari were requested and spread also in the 10th century, and through Italian mints, especially in Amalfi and Salerno, that produced certain essentially imitations that were, however, very easily identifiable because they were characterized by inscriptions that in a kind of imitation of the Arab alphabet, but that are not quite so, that they're kind of invented, because naturally these cities did not speak Arab, but they kind of tried to imitate what they found on the tari. This is important because kind of faking money is a very clever way to naturally to hoping to to having your money being taken, because the problem here is that you had to value the trust of how much wealth existed into, how much precious metal actually existed into these coins. So counterfacting money was definitely important because in part you could also speculate on it. You could load it with less precious metal, so devaluating them, and this was a damage naturally for the system as a whole, but these smaller centers were kind of making money out of that. And this is the idea of the mint, in especially in the Middle Ages, in these areas where these moments in history where the currency was also relatively rare, because it's a very important historical indicator, because the power which basically minted its name and over the coin was doing that because it was intrinsically recognized as trustworthy on the market, saying, I am this power that owns this amount of precious metal and that uses it, certifying that it he's really using it with that specific amount of precious metal that you can trust on the market. So all these smaller powers that were gravitating around were kind of tricking the system by saying, okay, let's imitate it, and let's maybe use less positive And so all tricks that are kind of existing all over history, and that, however, tell us so much in VII-XI in terms of economical power and dominance at the time. Eventually, when the trade balance shifted, especially in the 13th century, it was the Europeans now that were producing enough gold because they had accumulated them through this trade in turn, and that now had the strongest coin and the strongest currency at this point. And interestingly enough, oh, and by the way, what is interesting about this so-called pseudo-Kufic writing that you find in the Italian minted taris is that these guys were imitating Arab writing without understanding it. So the idea is how credible you are if you write something like that. Well, the obvious answer is that probably even the so-called Arab presence was not so intense as we imagine. When we talk about the Saracens, people get triggered. They immediately think Arabs, written in capital letters, Arabs. These were Arabs. No, these were not Arabs. As a matter of fact, there was a very few of Arab in here. The Arabs as such were a very narrow demic elite that didn't substantially impact anywhere where they went during the Arab invasions. These were kind of the Saracen powers now were kind of Arabized elites of populations that were kind of ethnically the same that existed previously to the Arab advance. So even the spread of Arab in this time, that you can imagine, that Arab is not like, in Christianity you can't translate the Bible in any language. In Islam it's not like that. In Islam you have to stick to Arab, and that's it. So also in here, think what literacy could be, I don't know, in North Africa or in the Mediterranean in the 10th century. I mean, maybe it wasn't so low as we imagine it, because these were areas in which trade brought necessarily to certain kind of literacy and education. But writing a pseudo-Arab letter on a coin and exchanging it means that the people who were using it didn't even recognize that it was not actually Arab, or that this is a very interesting cultural indicator, because it tells you how that was just a convention practically, and how there was not even such a great Arab influence after all. If not in, now I'm not an expert, I don't want to go in detail. Of course there was a strong Arab influence in many ways, but it was mostly a linguistical one, and nevertheless this easily recognizable coins were probably exchanged also somewhere. This is also a better explanation, where Arab traders were not operating. So just imagine, I don't know, there was this guy from from Pisa that was exporting into Central Europe in some way, or maybe to some Lombard, etc. And the Lombard simply knew that was an Arab coin, but obviously didn't know what was written on it, on the writing. So the important thing was just that it was a tari and it could be treasured, and that's it. And you find Arab coins literally everywhere in Europe, even in Northern Europe, treasured. You find them in England, in Scandinavia. I mean, and this was normal, because at that point the strong currency was coming from the Muslim world. And the trade balance brought to the idea that now was such for which the Europeans wanted to accumulate that and treasure that money, and because they couldn't produce it on their own. It's just in the low Middle Ages that basically trends to this intense trade with the Muslim world, increasing on the exports also from Europe, is that the Europeans managed to mint their own golden coins. That is the strongest money that exists out there. Interestingly enough, also in Russia, at this time, into Varangian Russia, there was Arab coin circulating, as we've seen. Although the golden one was less circulating, at least, because it was probably treasured, as we've seen, with great care. And or better, it was treasured because in there, especially there was a very kind of chronic lack of golden, precious metals, let's say. But there was a very intense exchange of silver coins, which suggests that also small trade activity, small business activities, and so were very much active, and that commerce was pretty much intense. So aside from this, I don't know how able I was to deliver this content. However, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.